Eric, I don't think either of us ever thought we would live to see 100, but here we are on the 100th episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. It's our 100th episode. This show is an offshoot of our successful paperbackwarrior.com blog, where you can read hundreds upon hundreds of vintage fiction reviews, articles, and you can access this show's archives. My esteemed literary scholar, friend, co-host, Tom, is bringing the show to you from his massive book library here in Florida. Tom, tell these fine listeners what we've cooked up for this very special episode.
Thank you, Eric. And first, let me say, happy anniversary, my friend. Who would have thunk it?
Thanks, man. Yeah, it's hard to believe. It's kind of like, look, Ma, we finally made it.
I know, it really is. Anyway, let's talk about today's show instead of spending all this time patting ourselves on this back for our longevity. Along with a few celebratory tidbits about the show's origin and progress, we'll be discussing the career of pulp and crime fiction writer Cleve Adams. Now, Adams began writing in the pulps in the 1930s, along with contemporaries like Raymond Chandler and Cornell Woolrich. He created successful series characters that would later transition into full-length original paperback novels. Along with our feature, I'll be reviewing a paperback called Sin Pit by Paul Mescal. And if I'm remembering this correctly, you're going to be reviewing a book by Lawrence Block called A Stab in the Dark. Is that right?
Yes,
okay,
correct.
Good. Excellent. And so you also have a note here that says, ask me why I'm reviewing Lawrence Block today. Eric, why are you reviewing a Lawrence Block book today?
I'm really glad you asked me that, Tom. So way back, our very first episode was July 8th, 2019. And on that debut, I reviewed a Lawrence Block novel called Sins of the Fathers. It was the first book in Block's Matthew Scudder series. That was episode 1, and here we are at episode 100, and I'm reviewing another Scudder installment. And I really wish I had something more, like, Lawrence Block called me on the phone and requested his book be featured in our 100th episode, but it's simply just the fact that I'm reviewing Block on the first and 100th episode.
Okay, well, Lawrence Block has been known to listen to our show and read our blog, and we are very appreciative of that, both being fans of his. I'm sure he's going to be thrilled to be an involuntary participant in our festivities today. And not to give ourselves too much of our own applause, but we thought it would be cool just to reflect on one or two of our favorite moments here on the show and how we've grown personally since the show started 3 years ago. And Eric, this is your baby. Why don't you go first?
Geez, it seems like such a short time, really, if you think about it, just 3 years, but my life has changed quite a bit. When we started this back in 2019, I was dating my wife, Sarah, and we were both living apart, renting. We got married in December of that year. We bought a house together in 2020. I adopted my stepdaughter at the time, Riley, last year. My work has expanded into other parts of the country. I got to lose part of my right lung. That was fun, and gosh, a lot of things have transpired when I think about it when we started this show. With 99 episodes to really look back on, I think there's a lot that come to mind. Thinking about the episodes, the first one I can think of was probably like episode 38. On that one, I was able to present the life and career of an author named Jan Stacy. Some of you might remember he wrote the 10-book series of 1980s post-apocalyptic novels called The Last Ranger. He also wrote the Doomsday Warrior series. I think he wrote the first one, or maybe the first few installments. He also wrote another series called CADS, C-A-D-S. But what was interesting about his career was that he was involved with the progressive movement in Washington Square in the 1970s. He did like the soup can artwork, which was later popularized by Andy Warhol. And he may have inspired an album cover for the Talking Heads. So my reveal on Jan Stacy was that he was a gay man living in New York in an era where there just wasn't enough support both socially and medically for gay men at the time. So Stacy suffered from HIV, and unfortunately he later died from AIDS. So again, that was episode number 38, and a written version of that story is on the blog as well. Just find Jan Stacy on the right-hand column of our desktop version. Another that I enjoyed presenting on the show was that of Patrick Clay. He was on episode 90, talking about him. I presented his literary work with the 1970s action-adventure series Sergeant Hawk. What was really cool about that feature was learning more about how the 1970s publishing industry worked and sort of pulled down the curtain on, Belmont Tower at the time. The Sergeant Hawk series was originally 4 total novels for Belmont, and Clay had revealed to me what inspired him to write that series, how it was optioned for television or a movie deal with Telly Savalas playing the lead, and Clay's own career. He retired as an attorney. He was an attorney for his whole life. There's also a feel-good ending to that feature because that feature and in our blog reviews, the Sergeant Hawk series was reprinted by the good folks at Rough Edges Press, a subsidiary of Wolfpack, right?
Wolfpack, yeah.
Yeah. Those are available in affordable paperback, ebook versions, and I think that they've actually released an unpublished Sergeant Hawk novel as well. So Clay and I formed a cool little friendship, and we correspond through email every so often. He's such a great guy. Tom, I remember some really cool features you did as well, which I think are the best of the show's history, honestly. That was the Casca controversy, episode 48, I think, and you had an awesome conversation with Richard Himble's son, which was turned into a feature about the author back on episode 57. So, tell me about some of your favorites. What are your memories?
Yeah, I think you were right when you cited the Casca episode, which really kind of broke format and became our own true crime mystery involving allegations of plagiarism in the Casca series. That was probably my brightest moment. It's certainly the episode for which I received the most feedback, both positive and negative. I also like the instructional episodes on how to build a robust paperback library on a budget, as well as how to organize a massive paperback library. I think those are evergreen and can resonate with anybody who spends a lot of time buying and reading paperback books that are just stacked up to the ceiling in their house. I also like stoking the flames of controversy with my ghostwriter episode, where we discuss the ethical gray areas of authors hiring ghostwriters to author books on their behalf. In the big picture, it's small ball, but for voracious readers, it's a big deal. It's like arguing about the designated hitter rule in baseball. Passions can run really high on these niche issues.
And Tom, I'd say we have covered just about all of the major crime noir authors of the mid-20th century. I mean, we've included features on, names like Gil Brewer, Day Keene. We talked about John D. MacDonald, David Goodis, Charles Williams. We did one on Brett Halliday, Ed McBain, Carter Brown. The list goes on and on. Bruno Fisher, Edward Ahrens, Ori Hitt, Charles Williford. I'm looking down the list here. Richard Deming, Lionel White, E. Howard Hunt, Thomas Dewey, Clifton Adams, William Ard, Ross McDonald, Robert Colby, Wade Miller, Donald Westlake. We did one on Max Allen Collins, and we did one on Richard Matheson as well. I mean, those are some heavy hitters.
And those are just the authors. We also looked at overviews of series titles we'd take the rest of the episode just listing all those. But let me just, off the top of my head, we got Quarry, Executioner, Johnny Lydell, Parker, Mike Shane, Matt Helm, The Trailsman, Nick Carter, Killmaster. Then we also covered stuff like Able Team, Phoenix Force, Death Merchant, The Butcher, Penetrator, Revenger, Survivalist, Edge, Doc Savage. The list goes on and on and on. And it's just, I look at us and I'm just very impressed on how awesome we are, Eric. But instead of, again, continuing to pat ourselves on the back, we have a show feature, and we got to get into this because time is ticking, and you know what to do, Eric. Play me some music.
Okay, today's feature is on Cleve Adams, not to be confused with Clifton Adams. Cleve Adams was a real cornerstone of pulp fiction in the 1930s and one of the many successful authors that transitioned into paperback originals. His career isn't recognized nearly enough today, but thanks to publishing houses like Steger, he's becoming relevant again. He certainly deserves some recognition. So Cleve Franklin Adams was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1895. Before becoming a writer, Adams worked as a copper miner, a window trimmer, an insurance executive, I can relate to that, art director, and operator of a chain of candy stores. And like you, Tom, Cleve Adams was also a real-life detective. He began writing mystery fiction for the pulp magazines around 1933, Apparently, Adams was good friends with another popular author that emerged around this time, Raymond Chandler. And using the gangster Pulp Fiction database online, Adams' first published short story may have been called Inspector Thomas Wins a Hat, which was published in Clue's All-Star Detective Stories, February 1933. Now, how about this debut for Adams? That same issue where his short story appeared also featured authors like Carol John Daly, Earl Stanley Gardner. I mean, that's really good company. This short story featured Inspector Mike Thomas, which was Adams' first Pulp series character. He would use the same detective in 4 more stories that appeared throughout the 1930s in Surefire Detective Magazine, Star Detective Magazine, Clues, and All Detective Magazine. Adams created another series of pulp stories starring female private eye Violet McDade and her partner Nevada Alvarado. McDade may be considered the first female hard-boiled hero. The character was once a circus fat lady and weighed in between 300 to 400 pounds.
So there's a lot of sexy content in that, right?
Yeah, right.
But apparently, crowd, huh?
Apparently she could hit hard, and that she carried twin guns apparently up her sleeves. I'm not sure how that's done, but that's what it says. McDade and Alvarado own a detective agency, and Nevada Alvarado is also the story narrator. Starting in 1935, there were a total of 13 Violet McDade stories published in Clue's Detective Stories through 1936. So between 1933 and 1936, Adams only had his Inspector Mike Thomas and Violet McDade stories published. But starting in 1937, he had about 10 standalone stories published in 10 Detective Aces, Headquarters Detective, Detective Fiction Weekly, and so forth. One of those stories was To Fought with Doom, which was published in the April 1937 issue of 10 Detective Aces. What's really interesting about that story is that it stars a private eye named Mike Shane. But however, this one is spelled S-H-A-N, not the more famous private eye, which was spelled S-H-Y-N-E.
Help me out. Which came first?
This came first.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
So when Brett Halliday created the Mike Shane character, you think he just picked a random name and decided to spell it different? I mean, this to me seems like too weird of a coincidence.
So this Mike Shane character is about 2 to 3 years prior to Davis Dresser's character. So yeah, certainly a possibility.
Wow, who knew?
Yeah. Also in 1937, Adams comes up with another character. This one is Lieutenant Steve McCloud, and he debuted in a short story called Private War in Detective Fiction Weekly, October 1937. McCloud is an insurance investigator that works for West Coast Indemnity. He deals with stuff like stolen diamonds, crooks, cops. Along with a Private War short story, there were shorts, Corpse COD, Smart Guy, both of those in 1939. In 1942, Adams loved the McCloud character so much that he crafted a full-length original novel starring that hero. That book is called What Price Murder. It was published in 1942, and then Popular Library reprinted it again in 1952 with really, really awesome artwork by Sam Cherry. Tom, if my memory serves, there's like really a number of insurance investigator types that were featured in crime fiction in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right?
Yeah, I mean, the one that comes to mind first in my mind would be Milo March, the fictional spy turned insurance investigator, created by Kendall Foster Crossan using the pseudonym M.E. Chabert. The series ran for 22 novels and a handful of short stories between 1952 to around 1973 or so, and it was really successful. Harlan Ellison also had an insurance investigator named Jerry Killian that appeared in several stories in the 50s and 60s. There was an Australian one, too, named Johnny Buchanan. And I think what you see more often than not in the golden age of detective fiction, even into the 50s and 60s, is insurance companies hiring private investigators to solve a case. Authors use this concept a lot. My favorite iteration was the Digger and Trace series of novels by Warren Murphy, who is the co-creator of the Remo Williams Destroyer series.
What's that series called? Is that it?
The Destroyer?
No, the other one that you just mentioned.
Trace?
Yes.
Digger? Yeah, Trace. Well, it's weird because Digger was the original one on Pinnacle, and there were like 4 or 5 books in the Digger series. Then Pinnacle cuts it off, and then Warren Murphy decides to continue the series, but he had this issue with Pinnacle, right? Because they somewhat had the rights to it. It was a little gray, and so Warren Murphy, back when he was alive, told me that he literally just changed every single character's name, all the recurring characters, and continued the story with the Trace books on Signet. And the Trace books were actually wildly successful because what he did was when Signet, because those guys are smart, when they marketed it, they had made the font look exactly like the Fletch books. And so the Fletch books were super hot after the Chevy Chase original movie. Everyone was reading the entire Fletch series, and then you would see the Trace books and almost think it was
Right.
one of the Fletch books. And it's written in a very similar tone. It's a kind of a wisecracking detective. In this case, he's working for an insurance company. But I would definitely recommend the Trace books and the Digger books. If you read one and then you're like, boy, I want more, you can just go to the other, and then you have to just adjust your brain for the fact that all the characters' names have changed.
Right, okay. Yeah, I've got a couple of those Digger books. I've always wanted to read them, but I just didn't know enough about the series to really tackle it.
The covers on the Digger books make them look like hard-boiled gun-toting books, but they're not. They're not action novels at all. They're really good and really funny detective stories because he's like a wisecracker and does undercover work and all that. And he's sort of an inept detective, and his Asian girlfriend Coco does a lot of the heavy lifting for him. But but they're not the gun-toting like
Right.
Mac Bolan covers that you see on the Digger books at all. So just kind of be braced for that.
Got it. Makes sense. One of Cleve Adams' most popular characters was that of Lieutenant John J. Shannon. He first appeared in the November 1937 issue of Double Detective. There were 6 short stories starring the character, and I think some of these, if not all of them, were written under Adams' pseudonym John Spain. Lieutenant Shannon is a police officer in these stories, but in 1942, Adams decided that Lieutenant Shannon deserved a full novel, so he features the character as the star of the novel The Private Eye. In it, Shannon leaves the police force to open up his own detective practice at the insistence of his girlfriend. Tom, this book must have sold really, really well. I see it listed in multiple printings, including at least 3 different versions by Signet. Although I do believe I think it's out of print now. I don't see any new reprints online. There was also another full-length novel starring Shannon. That one was called No Wings on a Cop, published in 1950. This book was finished by author Robert Leslie Bellum due to Adams' death, which we'll talk about in a few moments. In the fairness of time, I'm going to quickly just recap a few more characters he created. There was a duo called Lieutenant Kleinschmidt and Canavan. They appeared in 4 Black Mask issues in the 1940s. There's another called Connor O'Melvaney that appeared in the 1940s in Dime Detective magazine. I believe there are at least 3 stories featuring that particular character. Another character called St. George Silver appeared in 2 stories for Clues Detective Stories in 1938. And I'm not entirely sure, but he may have used the name Franklin Charles for some of these stories. Adams authored 2 novels starring Bill Rye. These novels were called Dig Me a Grave from 1942 and Death is Like That from 1943. Both of these books listed the author's name as John Spain. The character of Bill Rye is compared to Dashiell Hammett's Sam Spade character. Rye works as a detective for a Los Angeles detective agency run by a guy named Callahan, who apparently wields a lot of political power. From what I've read online about these books, Dig Me a Grave is the more superior work compared to its sequel.
Have you ever read any of the Sam Spade stories or books by Dashiell Hammett? Maltese Falcon being the most famous?
No.
Maltese Falcon's like a really good read. Like, it holds up extremely well today. Everyone, it's iconic as a movie, but the book is really solid. And so maybe put that on your reading list.
I should. Hammett did... the
Continental Op.
Yeah, Continental Ops.
Right, which are my favorite stories by him. Way more kind of blood on the knuckles, hard-boiled. Sam Spade's more of a wisecracking private detective, but he's not afraid to use his gun. And they're straight-up mysteries, but really solid. Like, there's nothing wrong with it at all.
I'll probably get a lot of hate mail on this, but I've never even seen Maltese Falcon. The movie? Yeah.
Read the book first. The movie, they did a very good job of adapting the book into the movie. Some of the dialogue is actually word for word, especially some of the funnier wisecracks. I would definitely read the book first and then see the movie. It clarifies a little bit of what's going on because the book obviously has the flexibility to go into greater depth.
Got it. Adams' most popular, or really infamous, characters is Private Detective Rex McBride. The character debuted in a story called This Is Murder in Double Detective May 1938, but the McBride character really became popular in a serialized novel called Sabotage, which was published in Detective Fiction Weekly. Now, Sabotage was subsequently published as a paperback in 1943, 1944, 1952, and 1957. The version I own is the 1957 Signet version with gorgeous artwork by, I don't even remember who that was. Where's Bob Dice? The Rex McBride character shows up in a few more short stories, but more importantly, the character stars in 5 more novels authored by Adams, and also a novel called Too Fair to Die. One of those books was called Shady Lady, and it was published as an ace double with Harry Whittington's One Got Away. But the last series book, which was Too Fair to Die, was started by Adams and finished by a combination of W.T. Ballard and Robert Leslie Bellum in 1951 after Adams' death. Tom, a lot of crime noir fans aren't that thrilled with the Rex McBride character. The story is that Adams basically ripped off Raymond Chandler for these McBride books, including the character itself. Supposedly, Adams was the first to agree with that statement. Like, he never hid the fact that he was influenced by Chandler. And if you'll recall, when I said earlier, he was really good friends with Chandler. So fans say that Rex McBride is too abrasive, hot-tempered, crude, drunk, and so forth. And here's a line that most people refer to as Adams' worst.
An American Gestapo is damn well what we need. The only way you can lick these guys is to fight as dirty as they do. Bite, gouge, and use a knee where it will do the most good.
And Tom, that was from, that was well done, by the way. That was from Murder All Over. But the year it was published was 1943.
I can see how that might have raised some eyebrows at the time. Of course, that was in the midst of World War II, and American and Allied forces were battling a dictator by the name of Adolf Hitler at the time.
So I wanted to see what the fuss was all about with the Rex McBride character, and so I decided to read Sabotage, the first novel starring this character. In the book, McBride is hired by an insurance company because they are underwriting a construction company that's working on this huge dam project in Nevada. But the insurance company is losing millions because of accidents on the job. Things like broken machinery, there's faulty supplies, there's a loss of a number of construction workers and laborers. The company thinks someone or some company is out to sabotage the dam's construction. So they hire McBride to investigate. The first thing McBride does is hit on the insurance company's receptionist. Then he gets so drunk he passes out and awakens to learn that he went gambling and he made $4,000 somehow. So McBride is a nutcase, Tom, but because he's the polar opposite of the well-defined good guy, it totally works. He's more sarcastic and funny than, say, Shel Scott. There's this one unforgettable scene where McBride is arguing with another guy, and no one's really winning the argument. So McBride screams out spontaneously, "Why don't you and I just sleep together?"
Now you're talking.
So I was like, wow, this was written in 1939, and that's funny. Also in the opening chapter, McBride is almost killed, and he just up and quits the assignment, like just flat out quits. Sort of. Anyway, he gets laid a lot, makes a pass at every single female character, and does some really abstract stuff that you just didn't see back then. The novel was lightning fast, and I had to really pay attention because of it. But anyhow, I loved Sabotage, and you can read my full review on the blog.
Cool. Well, Eric, I assume you're coming to the end of this feature, so pardon my interruption, but you asked me earlier today to do some research on a club called the Fictioneers and present my findings on this episode. I can see now how it all ties together.
Yeah, that was my next part. I mean, do they all wear, like, mouse ears or something?
Okay, so this is really cool. There's a book called Hollywood Troubleshooter, W.T. Ballard's Bill Lennox Stories. W.T. Ballard is also known as Todd Hunter Ballard. He wrote a ton of novels in the mid-20th century. Anyway, I was reading parts of this book, and he says this about the club, and I quote, "Most writers tend to cling to other writers. It's a lonely profession, and people in other lines of work have no conception of the problems that confront the writer. In the early 30s, we formed a little dinner club called the Fictioneers with 20 original members. Any writer who came to Hollywood was invited to join, and hundreds revolved through the meetings. We kept no records, charged no dues, and innocently laid down one rule: no business was allowed to be discussed. It was Eric Taylor's rationale that you don't catch a bunch of plumbers telling each other about the joint they wiped or why writers should waste an evening talking shop. We did talk shop, of course, but there was none of the jealousy or backbiting I found in New York. For one thing, when you can walk into a magazine office at will and to sell a story and gather market news, you tend to be suspicious of the next guy who can do the same thing and plug your market. But on the coast, 3,000 miles away, information was hard to come by, and every scrap and rumor any of us collected was shared with everyone else. Our cooperation went further. Whenever any of us got a check for little more than bare subsistence, we would climb into the car and make the rounds to find which of the brotherhood was not eating. Cleve Adams originated that practice. He was the Fictioneers' first secretary and had something of a father complex, was always ready to help anyone. End quote. Now, from what I understand, this dinner club occurred in Hollywood at the Nickelbob Cafe, which is on the corner of 9th and Western. It was reserved as a private dining room. Some of the authors that were part of this club were Frank Bonham, Raymond Chandler, William R. Cox, William Campbell Galt, Earl Stanley Gardner, and Dean Owens, to name a few. According to thrilling detective, Richard Matheson was invited by William Campbell Galt in 1951. Matheson was only 23 at the time, sitting around this dinner table with these legendary authors, talking to them. I mean, guys like Raymond Chandler were there, so it just must have been an amazing experience. Would have loved to have been a fly on the wall there myself.
So what's not so amazing is that Cleve Adams contracted pneumonia, and he died from it in 1949 at the relatively young age of 49. But man, a heck of a career, and that's a heck of a feature. I'd like to credit our source material for this feature. We used Francis M. Nevin Jr.'s article, The World of Cleve Adams, which was in Armchair Detective, May 1975. Also, the Thrilling Detective website, which has some awesome insight into the author's work. The Crime, Mystery, Gangster, Fiction Magazine Index, archive.org, and my visit with Stephen Mertz, where he told me to read Cleve Adams, and I'm glad I did. Tom, you've got a book review to present.
Yes. So first I want to show you this book. I think you may actually also have a copy. Stark House is coming out with this in September. It's called Lion Trio 3, Femmes Fatale. Okay, and what it is they've been doing these three... It's not a double; it's a triple, I guess.
Yeah, triple.
Triple novels, where from Lion Books in the 1950s, which was a big publisher at the time, and this is, I guess, is their third volume of 3 Lions Books paperbacks in a row. The combination for this set is Sin Pit by Paul Mescal, Dark the Summer Dies, which I'm actually reading right now and haven't finished, review to follow, but it's really good, by this guy Walter Untermeyer Jr., and the third book is The Devil's Daughter by Peter Marsh. But today, and so you got to check this out, Lions Trio 3, Femmes Fatale. These are 3 solid books coming out from Stark House in September, available for pre-order right now on Amazon. But let's talk about Sin Pit. So again, it was first published in 1954. It was the only known novel by this guy, Paul Mescal. Paul S. Mescal. According to an introduction that I read in a previous version of this, he was a New York crime reporter whose descriptive writing was lewd enough to catch the eye of a literary agent who encouraged him to write crime fiction. And so he turns in a manuscript called Bloodlust, which was later the title was changed to Sin Pit, which is this book that Stark House just reprinted. So the narrator is this East St. Louis police detective named Barney Black, who's thrust into a murder investigation involving a beautiful young woman with a .32 caliber bullet in her skull and whip marks all over her legs. Now, the novel's structured in a pretty standard police procedural, with Barney following logical leads in a corrupt town riddled with poverty and vice. The real appeal to this book, though, is Barney himself. He's 6'2", 210 pounds, he's 32 years old, and this guy is hard-boiled as hell. He is not afraid at all to slap a witness around to get him talking, or to take a belt of whiskey on the job to wash the taste of murder from his mouth. Barney's the kind of morally compromised but highly effective police officer that James Elroy later depicted in his classic L.A. crime stories. He's got a tragic backstory of his own that made him into a sociopath dedicated to holding criminals accountable solely because it's his job and not because of any functioning moral compass inside him. The characters and writing in Sin Pit are about as good as it got in 1950s crime fiction. When there's a sexy and alluring witness who threatens to warm Barney's cynical heart and generates human romantic feelings, the reader just knows it's not going to end well for these lovebirds. The hunt for the killer takes some really dark turns into a dungeon, and there's an S&M freak, and a world of darkness and corruption that exists right under Barney's nose. Man, Miskill's writing was really superb. It was some of the best I read from this era. He makes me want to shake my fist at the heavens, wishing he had written more than just this one book. So you should definitely seek this one out if you like your noir, twisted, and perverse. The original paperback might be difficult to find, but you can definitely get your hands on this Starkhouse triple. The book, again, is called Sin Pit by Paul S. Meskill.
Awesome. Thanks for that. So my book review this week, as I alluded to earlier, is a Lawrence Block novel called A Stab in the Dark. It was originally published in 1981, and it's the fourth novel in the Matthew Scudder series. If you aren't familiar with the series, you really should be. The series premise is that Scudder was a former cop who shot a couple of bad guys when he was off duty. One bullet ricocheted and killed a little girl. Scudder, although not fired or reprimanded for the incident, later just quit the police force. He's an alcoholic now, and he works as an unlicensed private detective. He does favors for people for money and gets referrals from his prior coworkers on the force. Tom, I got a question for you, just while I was reading this.
Yeah, lay it on me.
Why is he unlicensed? I can't remember. Why does he have a license?
I think he doesn't. He's sort of anti-paperwork in general. In fact, you've seen him in these books even say, like, I don't even really charge an hourly rate. Here's how much money I want you to give me. When I feel like I've done enough work for that money, you just give me more money. As a licensed private investigator myself, it would be really nice to work unlicensed.
Right, okay.
There's a lot of red tape and requirements and fees and taxes to pay. I mean, Matt Scudder's living in a flophouse hotel.
Yeah.
And so the idea that he's unlicensed is, I guess, just sort of presents us with sort of the rebel attitude, because at some of the books he's a straight up vigilante.
Yeah. Okay. Well, he's doing favors for people. So he's at a diner, and in comes this man named Charles London. London explains that his daughter Barbara was a victim of the ice pick killer 9 years ago. Barbara, along with 7 other victims, I guess 8 other victims, were murdered by this serial killer. The killer was never found. However, London explains that the police caught a man for another crime, and the man confessed that he was, in fact, the ice pick killer. He had pertinent information about each victim. However, he stated he never killed Barbara, and he wasn't able to provide any specific information that would link him to her death. So London hires Scudder to pick up the cold trail to find out who really killed his daughter. Tom, this book is fantastic. I expected nothing less, really, but Scudder, he interviews various parties that were linked to Barbara, and there's a few possible connections. What made it so good was just the emotional anguish felt by London trying to come to grips with his daughter's death all over again. So knowing she could have possibly been murdered by someone else, possibly for something he wasn't even aware of in his life or her life, it just drove him crazy. So I love Block's tone to these Scudder novels. They're just so dark, but they're shaded with all these characters that come in and out of the story. I also like Block's descriptions of the city. I feel like the city itself is a character, kind of like what Ed McBain does with the 87th Precinct. I felt like I was there, really. But anyway, you can read my full review on the blog. This was A Stab in the Dark by Lawrence Block, and it's another fantastic entry in the Matthew Scudder series.
I'm so glad you're reading these Scudder books. I mean, that was the series I grew up on in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and now the 2020s, because he's continuing to write them. So, stay with it, because the character just gets better and better over time.
Yeah, I've been really saving each book, because I know I've got a limited amount of books that I can read.
There's probably like 25 of them. Or
yeah, there is.
More.
I mean, I could probably sit down and read them all, but I've saved them.
And I should also say, because he sent me a review copy, he's got a book coming out, The Burglar Who Met Frederick Brown. And,
that's interesting.
It's his burglar series starring Bernie Rodenbar. It's coming out soon. I've sent a review copy. I have not read it. It's a much funnier series about a burglar named Bernie Rodenbar. In this one, Bernie Rodenbar also sells books for a living. He owns a used bookstore, and so somehow the idea of a Frederick Brown or a Frederick Brown book becomes in the mix on this thing. Some of the premise doesn't look promising to me, but it could be good. I mean, Lawrence Block wrote it, so it's got to be good. And I enjoyed the Bernie Rodenbar books kind of a lot if you're looking for lighthearted stuff. But everyone should check that out if you're a Lawrence Block fan.
I have something to add.
Yeah, lay it on me.
I totally forgot this at the beginning. So this episode starts a new chapter of the podcast. So this episode, if you want to watch it on YouTube, you can. But starting now, with this episode, you're going to be able to watch a video to go along with the audio. So on YouTube, instead of just staring at the episode cover, I'm going to have some images up there, some video of some of the things that we talk about, these books, book series, authors, things like that. I'll have some images to go with the audio. So you might have a more interactive experience, so to speak, by watching it on YouTube.
To be clear, you are not videotaping me right now talking to you. There's not a hidden camera in my home office here.
Right. The idea is to gain followers.
Right. So this is not a live podcast that he's talking about streaming on YouTube. But if you could think of it as sort of an interactive slideshow showing you the books that we're talking about as we're talking about them, it may be a fun viewing experience for you.
Yeah, try it out. We'll see how it goes. I'm new at the video editing thing, so we'll see.
Yeah. And that concludes our milestone episode. Thank you so much for listening to this one, as well as the 99 before it. Thank you for your support, your financial donations, your emails, feedback, comments, and most importantly, your ears. You listen to us so our wives don't have to. Remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube. On behalf of Eric, we will see you next time. Be cool.